So good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine. And we're going to try something. I'm not sure we've ever done this before, where we're both going to try to introduce Susan. So Alyssa will go first.
Good evening, everybody. And the reason we're doing this, as you might have guessed, is because I cannot overstate how much we love Susan Coll. We are so lucky that she has worked at P&P on and off for most of the 13 years that we've been owners here. She was, I think, the first person we hired. It's a very smart move. And she's just a person beloved by every single one of our staff, by everyone she encounters in the publishing industry. In fact, I was just on the phone earlier today with a very well-known editor and publisher in New York who somehow Susan's name came up, and I said, oh, we're having an event with her tonight, and this editor just, I could barely stop them from talking about how wonderful Susan is. And, there are many reasons that we are so fond of her. Obviously, she's an incredibly talented writer. She's also generous. She has one of the most generous spirits of anybody I've met in this industry or really beyond. You can tell by the number of people she mentors, very unfailingly, very unselfishly, never looking for credit. She's generous to everyone she works with here at P&P. I think it is why she is so beloved. She's generous with her support of all the people who work here, of trends in the literary industry. She's obviously been very involved in the literary community in DC in many capacities. And so for us, it's really not just a pleasure and a joy, but it's also really an honor to have Susan in our midst and on the staff here, but also as a very, very dear and cherished friend. And Brad will tell you a little bit more about her work as a writer and her work here. But anyway, that's why you see the two of us. We love Susan.
And I knew that if Alyssa went first, there'd be nothing left for me to say. I will say something about Susan's work. I mean, through her previous 6 books, Bookish People, The Stager, Beach Week, Acceptance, Rockville Pike, and KarlMarx.com, Susan has developed quite a distinctive voice in her fiction. It's a voice that's quirky, funny, relatable, warm-hearted, kind of zany. And her stories are often rooted in situations and scenes familiar to, many of us who live in this area, because that's where, of course, Susan's lived for many years and drawn so much of her inspiration. Some of her friends who've already read Real Life and Other Fictions consider this her best yet. One thing it may do is expand your vocabulary. How many of you know the word for fear of crossing a bridge? Anybody? Anybody know that word? Somebody does? Who? Anybody raise their hand? No? Okay. Well, the word is gyphyrophobia. Gyphyrophobia. Look it up. It appears early in the book, which should be a clue, at least, that a bridge tragedy will factor in the plot. And you'll hear more about that, I'm sure, in a minute. Also, one other word, who knows what a cryptozoologist does? And a hint that it has nothing to do with cryptocurrency. Anybody know what a crypto... Huh? What? Microorganisms? Well, not quite. It's someone who searches for and studies unknown, legendary, or extinct animals whose present existence is disputed or unsubstantiated, like a giant Mothman, and that also factors significantly in the book. Anyway, I'll just say that this novel, like so much of Susan's writing, is entertaining and captivating, with a main character, Cassie, who will draw you in early to the road trip that she impulsively embarks on. Her own search for answers about her parents' tragic death touches such larger themes for us as the line between what's real and what's fiction, why certain myths tend to last long in the public imagination, and how we can change direction in our lives when we're stuck and find a way to move on. In conversation with Susan this evening will be Gwydion Suilebhan, who currently serves as executive director of the Penn Faulkner Foundation, where, by the way, Susan just completed a term as president. Gwydion himself is a playwright and is, along with his Penn Faulkner post, project director of the New Play Exchange for the National New Play Network. Plus, he's working on a social history of Jewish American comedy. Who knew Jewish people were funny, huh? He's a great conversation partner for Susan this evening. Please join me in welcoming Susan Coll and Gwydion Suilebhan.
Well, that was great.
Yeah, I think we can stop here.
Oh,
that
yeah,
was
yeah.
amazing.
Let's call it
Thank
a
you
night,
both
shall
so
we?
much.
Actually, Susan, I'm wondering if you could do us the favor of just kicking us off by reading the opening of your novel. We're going to have a lot of questions, but the novel just drops you right in, and I think we all need to experience that.
Okay. Thank you. The title of chapter 1 is The Incident on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. A heavy gray slush begins to fall from the sky, and the windshield wipers turn themselves on, startling me. Although the car is 7 years old, it's new to me, and I'm still getting used to its high-tech features, many of which are already obsolete. It has none of the self-driving technology one reads about, for example, so it's entirely on me to stomp on the brakes to avoid hitting the car ahead as traffic comes to an abrupt stop. The vehicle with which I mercifully did not plow into is a green Honda CR-V with a University of Virginia sticker affixed to the top right corner of the rear windshield. The speed at which I am traveling is precisely 1 mile under the 50 miles per hour speed limit. I lock into these details because I am the sort of law-abiding to a fault motorist who minds the rules of the road, always staying at or below the speed limit, and because my daughter, Vera, has only a few days ago completed her first semester at the University of Maryland. In front of me is presumably another student or former student or the parent of a student or an instructor or someone student adjacent in one form or another, albeit at a different public institution of higher learning. But also, I lock into these details as a way to ground myself. I'm feeling light, without anchor, as if I might unbuckle my seatbelt and crack the window and slip through the slit like a puff of steam or a whiff of smoke. It's not simply that my daughter is away for the holidays for the first time in 19 years. I've also just left my husband. I've brought to conclusion a long, painful stalemate, taken my poorly behaved puppy, and walked out the door. No harsh words were exchanged, although I had half hoped for a provocation, or at least some display of emotion, when I told him that I was leaving, that I was headed to my aunt and uncle's house on the Delaware shore. We were meant to go together. It was our family's long-standing tradition to spend the week between Christmas and New Year's at the beach, and I confess there was still a piece of me that hoped he would protest, that he would apologize and suggest we sort things out, bundle up and take some long walks along the sea, and clarify our situation, maybe find a way to start anew. Instead, he replied only with a warning. The last place you want to be in a weather event is on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. Richard and I have been idling in an indeterminate state for some time now and have more recently begun to trend in the direction of collapse. After a series of problems with which he has refused to engage, first professional, then personal, Richard moved into the basement, where he now works and sleeps. This morning, as I departed, I told him I couldn't live like this anymore. But what precisely I hope to achieve, I can't say for sure. I suppose I would have welcomed any sort of reaction, anger included. At least it might have moved us toward the next place, whatever that might have been. But my formerly dynamic, rabble-rousing, storm-chasing meteorologist husband has imploded on so many different, spectacularly painful levels that there's little left of him or of us. He's like a star that has collapsed under its own gravity, a black hole, a closed presence that spends most of its time and space crafting copy for the newspaper's weather desk, staring at a bank of screens. Before slamming on my brakes, I had been singing along loudly to a catchy, infectiously upbeat song that included lyrics about a dog, sung, or rather hoarsely and charmingly croaked, by an oddly named band called Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah. In the song, the dogs have quit their barking. In my car, as it came to an abrupt stop, my dog's barking had just begun. Luna, my puppy, now barks and barks and barks. She stops for a moment and begins to bark again. In the rearview mirror, I glimpse something fluttering. An insect appears to have presented itself in the car. It flutters, it lurches from one window to the other, flutter lurching back and forth madly, which I believe is what prompted the puppy to bark. As my foot continues to press hard on the brake, I wonder idly whether it's odd to have an insect trapped in the car in winter. I catch another glimpse and realize it's a moth. At this point, I feel a shift in my equilibrium, a minor anxious jolt. To keep myself from thinking about the possibility of being stuck in a traffic jam on a 4-mile-long bridge nearly 200 feet over the largest estuary in the country, I try to focus on practical matters. If the traffic does not ease, I should tell my aunt and uncle I'll be arriving later than planned. Also, I'm low on kibble for the puppy and make a mental note to order more for overnight delivery. Entirely unrelated, I need badly to find a new hairdresser and do something about my too long, nearly feral hair. I take a deep breath, the sort a yoga teacher might recommend, but my thoughts continue to boomerang toward the end of my metastable marriage, then toward the steel and concrete structure, plus the open water, plus the possible moth. This might or might not be a good place to mention that my parents died in a bridge collapse, an event that was presaged, some say, by the appearance of a giant moth. I was never sure what to make of this story, but I find myself obsessed with it nonetheless. Thank you.
Come on. It's a really great opening to a novel. And within one page later, you have this sentence. I tell my students that the DNA of the entire story is contained in its opening pages. In the first few pages, you've got a bridge collapse, a failing marriage, a moth, a dog, bad weather. And it's a little bit like you're setting up themes the way a jazz musician will set up the themes and then recur and twist for the rest of the novel. Can you tell us more about that particular set of symbols, that the DNA, where you think it comes from in this novel?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I'm not sure how much of it is thought through in the beginning. I'm just trying to get the basics of the story out. But I always find, and I'm at this spot right now with the next book, where I don't know how to end it. And the answer's always already in there. It's already back at the beginning. And every single book I've written, I have found that to be true. If I just go back and reread the opening, once I've got the opening working, this opening took a very long time to get right, but the answer's already in there.
Yeah, I mean they're like symbols. We were talking beforehand. They're like symbols, and they recur in different ways, and it's a little bit like this novel can be decoded as you're reading it.
Yeah, I think there's even more bridge symbolism than I was aware of as I wrote it. I'm reading to review a book right now that has nothing to do with bridges, and all of a sudden there's this incredible bridge metaphor in the book that points out that bridges are connections, but they're also traps, and I hadn't really thought about it that way. So
your book is also coming out not long after a major bridge collapse. It's not publicity, I know, but
that was really astonishing to read. about the Key Bridge in Baltimore. It's the Key Bridge, right?
Yeah.
In part because as I researched this book, I read a lot of headlines about the Silver Bridge collapse in 1967 in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which is a real event and one of the deadliest bridge collapses in modern history. And the headlines were very, very similar. I mean, except for the fact that, thank goodness, there were fewer fatalities in Baltimore, but still 6 of them. But just the shocking headlines, just the shock of such an event were very similar.
Were there giant moth sightings before the Key Bridge collapsed too?
I haven't read of any, but should I talk about the Mothman?
That's my way of teeing that up for you. Yeah.
This story captured my imagination when I first heard about it, which I swear I heard about from one of my fellow booksellers here, someone who used to work here, who did our website. They know who I'm talking about. And when I wrote to him to thank him for inspiring this book, he had no idea what I was talking about. So either one of us has a false memory of that. But when somebody here told me this story of the Mothman, I got in my car and drove 6 hours by myself to West Virginia, which is not the sort of thing I usually do, but I needed to see what this town was like, what the Mothman Museum was about. And so in the year or so before this bridge collapse, there were multiple sightings in the area of a giant creature that people said was part man, part moth, and that it was not an evil force. It was more of a warning. And it has supposedly been seen before other major disasters, including Chernobyl and the apartment bombings in Moscow. And then if you look on the internet, there's a lot. There's a lot of rabbit holes.
The internet has a way of doing that. Yeah.
But it was recently seen in Chicago, I think in 2019. I'm not sure that there was any disaster, but then you can always come up with one, right? You can take any bad thing that's happened and then apply it
confirmation
to the Mothman.
bias.
Right, confirmation bias, which is something I talk about in the book, the way, once you learn a new word, suddenly you hear that word all over, but also with bridges. Now that I have bridges on the mind, I see bridge metaphors all over the place. So
it's like when you break up and all of a sudden all the songs on the radio are about your relationship, right? They aren't really any different, but you see yourself in them.
Right, exactly.
I've been thinking about how I would describe the genre of this book to the many, many people I'm going to recommend it to. And it's not an easy answer. There's just so much going on here. I'm wondering how you would describe it and what's your sort of elevator pitch, the way you would describe the novel.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the line from the new Beyonce album. Linda Martell starts off one of the songs and says, genre is a tricky little thing. And that's been rattling around in my head because I don't know how to describe this book. I just think of it as comedy, literary comedy, but then so much of genre gets defined by the publisher and who they want to be marketing the book to. So I get a lot of comments often, always, really with all of my books, because it always falls into the same kind of cracks of what is this book. People say on the dreaded Goodreads or other review sites, I picked this up and this book was not at all what I expected. And I'm getting a lot of that with this book. So I don't know how I would describe it other than, a comedy, but it's hard to describe it as a comedy because it's also about a really tragic bridge collapse. And some of the titles that were being proposed were not really capturing that. They were really too light and whimsical. And I was like, no, 64 people died in this bridge collapse. So it's a comedy, but it's not,
comedy I write about comedy. Comedy has tremendous depth, and there's always other layers beneath the jokes. But your novel is psychological, it's symbolic, it's existential, it's lots of things. It is a comedy, but it's comedy plus in some way, yeah.
Well, thank you for saying that. I've kind of had this genre problem since I went to shop my first novel, KarlMarx.com, which started off as a historical novel about the suicide of Karl Marx's daughter Eleanor, and all the editors who read it said, "This is really funny." Like, all right, this is not a comedy. So I finally leaned into the comedy.
It to me, and I haven't read too much of your work, but this feels very much like a novel of yours in that it has historical elements, in that it has comedy, in that there's, both of those things playing against each other. The history was the way into KarlMarx.com, right? This too, right? Wasn't the
Yeah.
Mothman your way in?
Yeah, this bridge
The bridge
collapse
collapse.
and the Mothman were definitely the way in, and a story I wanted to tell, but it also was probably the most outside of my knowledge base book. Everything I've written, as Brad and Lissa pointed out, has been mostly sort of set here and set from things that I was familiar with. But this was just a story I wanted to tell.
I, okay, I have to ask a straight-on comedy question, and it's almost embarrassing for me to ask this, but your book is so funny, and it's instantly funny. We were all laughing through those first few pages, and then it just cascades from there where you dropped off. Within 3 pages, I was slapping my knee, and I'm going to ask the embarrassing question: is how do you do that? Like, how do you do it? Where does it come from?
Well, thank you. I have no idea. I mean, I can ask you the same question. You're writing about comedy. You probably have studied it more than I do. But I think a lot of the inspiration for everything I've written has come from when there's a sort of a difficult situation, and that finally I start to see the humor in the situation. So, with this, I guess it's different. The comedy for me started to occur, and there's a scene when she gets to West Virginia and meets this cryptozoologist, and sometimes you have to write half the book to understand what the book is, and then I went back. I kind of found the comic rhythm of it. But thank you for saying that.
Yeah, I just felt like you must be asking yourself, what would be the funniest thing to happen next in this opening chat? What would be the next thing to go wrong to heighten the stakes? Anyway, I also want to quote you from later in the book. Sometimes I wonder if I am anyone at all, or just a composite of the people I know and the stories I've read. That is quite a sentence, right? There's a sort of note of existentialism and a blurring of the lines between real life and other fictions. So what's that about? How's that element working in the novel for you?
Well, thank you. That's a good question. That line was kind of buried in the book, and a couple people sitting here kept telling me to move that up. I didn't really. It was kind of a throwaway line for me, but I think a lot of that has to do with teaching writing, and a lot of my students are here. Thank you for coming out. And I've been teaching writing for probably 20 years or so, everything from these really intensive year-long workshops. I see Margaret from the Writer Center here. Thank you for letting me teach these classes. And but I started off teaching intro classes too. So I've taught a lot of students, and all of these stories are in my head, and I often don't get to see what happens to them next, especially with the intro students. So I think that part of that informed that sentence, but also I'm just a reader. I've grew up on books, and I feel like every book I read affects me and changes me in some way. So it's a combination of all of that.
Of course, we don't want to confuse the main character with you, but she is a writing teacher, and so
yeah, that's the only part that I would
Yeah.
say. Well, that and the dog,
And the dog.
the dog are probably the only autobiographical parts. Yeah.
Hopefully a lot of the psychological stuff that's going on for Cassie is also not it doesn't also come from you. It's really profoundly psychologically complex. She's got repressed family secrets. There's a huge tragic accident. There's a marriage on the rocks. At the same time as there's a new love, and not to spoil anything in the novel. So I want to ask you: does that take a toll on you to live in that space as you're writing the novel?
No, it's a good space to occupy. Really, you get, what a privilege in a sense to be able to just go into this other world where you get to, play with words and figure out the plot. I am or was a jigsaw puzzle obsessive. I've stopped doing them because my
We have
dog
this in common.
eats.
No, that's
Well,
true.
my dog eats the pieces. So, again, ask me about the dog in the book. But yeah, writing a novel is very much like doing a jigsaw puzzle. You're just playing with the pieces for a very long, in my case, a very long period of time until your stepdaughter comes along and does the whole puzzle in 30 seconds. But other than that, it takes me a very long time to put it together. So no, it's a good place to occupy, I'd say. You get to kind of step out of all of the chaos of what's happening in the world.
That's great. I know, yeah, that's just a lot of torturousness going on there, which you capture very, I think, accurately or believably. And yeah. Okay, it might be, so the book references the film, The Mothman Prophecies, a lot. And again, I don't want to give away any of the sort of ties. I'll let you decide what to give away or not give away. But as I was reading it, and it's perhaps because of the references to that movie, I kept thinking to myself, this is a very filmable book. You can just see, and it's, I know Joan Cusack was in one of your an adaptation of one of your books before. You can see a younger Joan Cusack in this role. That kind of, anyway, do you think in those terms at all as you're writing? Do you think visually?
Well, I'll start with the Mothman prophecies because I don't think that gives too much away. It comes up pretty early, but there was a movie made about this bridge collapse called The Mothman Prophecies in 2002, and it starred Richard Gere and Laura Linney. But it took this story of the Mothman in a horror direction, sort of a suspenseful horror film, whereas I took it more in a kind of comic direction. And my character's so haunted by this movie that it's sort of dictated a lot of her life. I don't really allow myself to think about that. I mean, maybe in my, moments, but I don't really think like that because that's just almost jinxing the whole idea that it might ever happen. But in my fantasy, it would be Laura Linney and Richard Gere would return and lose some years.
Yeah, that would be great. Let's get
it's
that.
Available for option.
Yeah. If there's anyone in here connected in any way, that's great. Your character is obsessed with the Mothman, and the technical term that you teach us in the novel is cryptid, right? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
It's like a Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. Those are cryptids, and the Mothman is another cryptid. Can you talk? You sort of talked to us a little bit about it, but can you define that term a little better than I just did, and define?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can define it any better than it's a kind of it's defined as pseudoscience, which the cryptozoologist in my book objects to because if you believe in it, it's not pseudoscience, but it's a creature that can't be rationally explained. And again, this is not my usual field. I'm not someone who's spent any time thinking about cryptids before this book, but part of what's so fascinating to me about this, well, a couple things. One, how do you explain all of these sightings among people who are, I don't know what word I'm fishing for, normal people, but not, you just citizens of this town in West Virginia going about their business, suddenly seeing this creature. And the sightings are all very similar in nature. Apparently a German shepherd was chased by this Mothman. And the theories of what happened there are fascinating to me. Again, another internet rabbit hole you can go down, but some of them are possibly legit. I mean, there's theory, well, the most legit ones are that it was a giant sandhill crane or some other creature of that nature. But also, this area was a munitions site during World War II. So there's uranium, enriched uranium had been stored there. So it's possible people think that there was some government conspiracy to distract the public from the fact that this later became a Superfund site. So maybe like the government was floating fake Mothmen or a fake Mothman to distract from that. And then you get into the whole alien theory, which I go into in the book a little bit, but I don't know. I mean, these things happen. There's UFO sightings. It's hard to know. So,
And that we get back to the title, the real life and other fictions. It's like there's a level of uncertainty about what to believe and what's true, and it gets personal for this main character, and it's also about all these things, right? You know, your main character has some family stuff that she has to
Yes.
dig into. Again, trying not to spoil.
Yeah, I mean, again, that part I don't think is a spoiler too much. That just she was orphaned in that bridge collapse, so she never knew her parents and has been raised by her aunt and uncle, who've been fabulous. She's had a great, not traumatic upbringing, but they would never talk about what happened. They wouldn't talk about why her parents were in West Virginia on this bridge, and you couldn't raise the subject of the Mothman at all. So this is that's kind of the inciting incident, and as they say in writing classes in this book, is that she's finally just going to set out and figure out what happened.
Yeah, I think we all know family secrets. They're things that just don't get talked about, and that's what makes this, I think, more than just a slapstick comedy. There's the driving quest to get at something real in the fictions of her life and in the fictions of the world. How much? So, in addition to a deep dive into the Mothman story and the Silver Bridge collapse, I'm sure you did a ton of research. There's also meteorology plays a giant role in this as well. So can you talk to us about how you go about research, where you'd stop when you've got enough, how you know?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm sort of waiting till someone calls me out on some of this because I don't know West Virginia very well. I've been a few times, but even the copy editor at the very last phase of editing was pointing out my West Virginia geography was really, really off. So, so I hope in the end I got it right, and I did put an author's note in saying I referenced the geography problem. But the research, there was a lot. Well, the question's how do I know when I've got enough?
How do you go about it? How do you know when you've done too much? When you've done enough?
Oh, well, with the meteorology part, that was what I was going to say. That's the other part I'm a little nervous about because I did talk to a couple of meteorologists, including Matthew Capucci, who we had here for an event. I went to his event and bought his book and read it, and then I called Matthew Capucci. So I did get a little bit of advice from him. And then of all the strange coincidences, my very young cousin is now a meteorologist in Albany, which I didn't even know at the time. So both of them gave me some good ideas about how a meteorologist could blow up a career, which was, as you heard referenced in the beginning, was exactly what I needed. But the rest of the meteorology stuff, I just, again, Matthew's book and some internet deep dives. But there's something very soothing to me about reading the weather as in the old print newspaper every morning. And the New York Times has now changed it. They don't have the local weather, which is really a loss in my opinion, but I still read it every morning, and there's something very poetic about it. I would love to talk to the person who writes those. And in my book, I have them being crafted into little weather haikus, and I don't know if there is a plan when those are written, but just try reading them. It's almost like it's better than reading your horoscope. It just tells you, even if the weather is about what's happening in Des Moines, it's still sort of centers me. But I don't know a whole lot about meteorology apart from that. But I think, it's not really what the novel's about. So it was hopefully easy enough to write about that. Also, the New York Times did one day have a little description about how to write about the weather. And I learned that those little blurbs that go above the masthead are called weather ears. And I learned a lot of the techniques they use. I forget what they are. I probably have them in the book, but like they're always in present tense, or they're always there's a lot of rules that they abide.
So basically, you just until when you have what you need for the novel, you're done. You don't want to become like an expert on meteorology. You just
Right. No, I probably, if I hadn't been on deadline, I might still be researching meteorology and taken many more trips back to West Virginia. But at some point, I had to just write what I had.
Yeah.
But
So we have time now, I believe, for questions. We've got a microphone up here, and I know there's some former students who would probably love to pick their teacher's brain. If anybody wants to come up to please come up to the microphone. Yeah, thank you. If
I
there's a
can,
microphone
there's
right,
one there,
right here.
or I can shout your question out.
Yeah. No hurries.
Susan, first, congratulations.
Thank you.
Secondly, what was the inspiration for writing this book? And by that I mean the transition from bookish people to this, where you had, I would say, 13 years of inspiration. I still listen, Brad. But where you tried to address some greater themes in this book than some of the kind of interpersonal relationships you explored in bookish people.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a story that had just been in my head for, since I started working here, really. So I don't remember how long that is, but at least 12 years or so that I'd just been chewing on. And I started to try to work on it back then, and it just wasn't the right book. So when I sat back down and wasn't sure what to do next, I went back to West Virginia and took another visit to this Mothman Museum and saw the town. And so that's really the only answer I have. I didn't go into it with any real sense of how I was going to write this book. This book might have been more of a struggle than anything I've ever written, because I didn't know what the story was. I just knew I wanted to tell this story. So it took me a long time to figure out who the characters were and how to find my way into this story. So.
There actually is a connection of sorts, too, between some of the people here and this book, right? Because, no, right, you thank them. You thank some of them.
Yes,
so I just want to give you a chance to
do.
mention that connection.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you. Yeah, when I started talking about this book with my colleagues, and I usually don't do much of that because I'm kind of embarrassed about what I'm doing when I'm not here. I kind of prefer being here to writing. But I was surprised. I was back there in the events department where I work, and I mentioned the Mothman, and all of a sudden, like, the place lit up. I had no idea how many booksellers know about the Mothman and get excited about the Mothman, and a lot of them gave me good tips about where to get more information. Andrew Pettis told me to go listen to this podcast that was amazing. I learned so much from that. And Morgan Harding, who's here, told me about an item that I won't say what it is, but that appears toward the end of the book. And lots of people here Anton was always sending me Mothman stuff. So everyone was very encouraging, and I found that helpful.
The staff here knows a lot about some very weird things,
Yes.
Always,
and a lot about books.
And a lot about books, yeah. There is one line in your book, and I think you're quoting someone else, and you say that, fiction comes in sort of, there are two main stories in fiction, and one is the journey theme, and the other is a stranger comes to town theme. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's from the John Gardner Art of Fiction. Is that the title of that?
That
Yeah.
is, yeah.
And yeah, there's only two kinds of stories, as Brad said. A stranger comes to town and just passing through. Yeah. So that line came up just kind of out of the blue at a pivotal scene for me. And I think, again, I heard an author talk here who, Jennifer Egan. Yeah, you'll see like all of my, everything I put in here is either from reading books or listening to other authors talk here. But I heard her say that, and I found it very inspiring that they're all the same story, so, which I hadn't thought about in that way before. So that's what is happening for Cassie when she winds up in West Virginia and someone asks her which she is, and it's all the same thing.
You talked about a little, like an answer ago, about this story being stuck and you being stuck. What advice would you give to the writers in the room about how to get that story out of your head?
Yeah, I'd say two things. One, what I said before, just go back to the beginning. The answer's in there somewhere. But also just keep writing. Just force it out, which is, again, what I'm doing right now. I feel I'm like 3/4 of the way through the next book, and I keep thinking I'm out of steam. I don't know where it's going. But if I just keep going and not worrying about how sloppy it is or nonsensical it is, new bits emerge. And I'm not a very like mystical woo-woo person about writing, but it does happen that sometimes the book just knows what it wants to be. And I have a line in this book about that too. As I was struggling to get it off the ground, it seemed like it knew it wanted to be set in winter. It wanted to be in present tense. There were just a lot of things I was going about the wrong way. And once I started tweaking all that, it fell into line. So don't give up is what I would say.
This is the new book you're working on, is the one about the literary nonprofit that's not Penn Faulkner, right?
It's not Penn Faulkner. No, it's not Penn Faulkner.
Yeah.
It's called Washington Literary Nonprofit, if that helps.
Oh, excellent.
Like Washington football team.
Yeah.
You were just talking about the process, and that's what I actually wanted you to talk a little bit more about. When you start, do you go through it, piece by piece, as one narrative, and then you go back and redo it? Do you start at chapter 1 and then maybe jump to, well, this is going to be later, and I'll write that scene? How do you do that? And I'm interested in if you have any sort of writing rituals that you do. Do you have to have a cup of coffee in front of you? Do you use a special something, I don't know, computer, whatever?
Thanks. No, I don't have, I always write from the beginning to the end. I'm kind of in awe of people who say that they're working on the middle or the end or a scene. I can't do it that way. It needs to be continuous for me to see this story. And I never really know what I'm doing, if that was part of the question. I just sort of start and figure it out. Sometimes I can have a sort of sense of where I have a general sense of where it's going, but I don't know the particulars. And my only ritual of sorts is I write in the morning, and that's just a leftover from when I had very young children underfoot. And the only time I could write was when they were off at school for a couple hours a day when they were little, just the time between when one would go and one would come home. So I've always been very disciplined about that time, and I try to continue that. So I write in the morning, and now I'm working here part-time, so I do that in the afternoon.
And just one, thank you. And one more question. Do you have a favorite among the books you've written? Because you've written, you can have a whole shelf of your books at this point.
Well, thank you. I don't know. I want to say this one maybe because it's the least expected, even from me. I'd also say The Stager, but that's the one that probably did the least well. So it's the most underread of my books, I think. But thank you. Hi.
Hi. Well, I'm one of the many people. This is my favorite of your books, so thank you for that. And one thing I found surprisingly in this book, because it takes place all over the place, but definitely in all your other books, I feel very, very seen. You have lines throughout that I'm like, are you in the store taking notes? How do you capture the zeitgeist of the community, which is not just here, it's in lots of places, so perfectly. How do you keep a little notebook? Like, that was a crazy comment. Did you see those shoes? How do you capture those people? And myself included.
Well, thank you. I don't even know the answer to that. I do not keep a notebook. I should, because then I'll think, oh, what was that great line? So I don't know. Maybe I'm just living in my head all the time and absorbing what people are saying and thinking without knowing it. I just read a lot. I don't know the answer to that, but
it's remarkable, and it keeps me going.
Well, I'm glad you felt seen. I remember you sent me a line where you felt seen. That I appreciate that.
I think it was the line that you quoted here.
Oh yeah, no, it was about being prevailing in the house, kind of. Being judicious in the workplace or something.
There you go. So
I remember.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
So now I know why we never scheduled any meetings with you before 11 a.m.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, that's why if I interrupt my morning, I get a little crazy. So.
You can all understand why we were living in terror when Bookish People was being written. In fact, Brad forgot to say that I think when we hired you, Susan, we made you promise that you would never write about anyone or anything to do with the bookstore.
You did, yes.
And she did promise, and we're still friends, which there you go. But I just wanted to kind of revisit this question that you asked about genre and whether this writing style is comedic fundamentally, because I haven't read the book and I'm dying to, especially after hearing the opening, which is fabulous. But your other books, I think of them as almost being satire, that you're taking sort of common universal experiences that most people in this room would recognize as being part of their lives or the worlds they inhabit, and pointing out the absurdities of a lot of what they experience and maybe shining a light on that. And that does have a kind of profundity to it. But the reason that I started with, we were all terrified when Susan was writing about the bookstore, and you're obviously already in terror about, literary nonprofit.
Oh, yeah.
So the question is to kind of, and it sort of goes to the previous question too, are you absorbing are you going around like every day just going, that is the most absurd thing I've ever seen, and that person is really like, is that how you experience the world on a daily basis, or is there something that happens to you when you're writing that these things kind of become clear to you as satirical, worthy of either making fun of or pointing out in some comedic way the more serious aspects of them?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. But speaking of genre, when I first tried to sell my first novel, everyone said, don't use the word satire. That was another genre trigger for whatever reason. And also just to, I when I came here, I did promise I wasn't working on a novel about a bookstore. And I wasn't until I briefly left and was left on the daily email end of day reports, which I kept saying, take me off these reports. But I was on there for a long time, and they were very funny. When you read about it from a distance, I couldn't help it.
This is my point. She's proving my point.
Now I don't remember what the question was, though.
It's really about, is this how, your example of reading the end of day report is sort of answers the question you actually, in your just mere existence, are experiencing the world in this way where the absurdities are somehow clearer to you than most other people.
Yeah, I'm really not taking notes, and I'm not going about my life with a book in mind. I love, I guess I don't need to say this here, but I love working here. So it's never been about it being for the material, and the same with Penn Faulkner, of course. So it's really not about that. It's just at some level, the humor of it just seeps in. So yeah, I'm not studying it.
Okay, we'll.
So there's an article I think it was in the Post this weekend about a person who reads books for a living and how they sort of filter that into their lives. And I was trying to sitting here thinking, and I know you're a pretty voracious reader. How does that work in to your time, your sort of being while you're writing a book, reading other people's work at the same time you're working on yours?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like it's twofold, working here and being involved with Penn Faulkner, where I wanted to, read all the finalists for the awards. And I want to read as much of a book as I can before I do an introduction, and I do occasional reviewing. So there's just so much reading, and so I feel like I know a lot about every book, but I only know a little about, I only know the books that I've read. But I find it very inspiring to read while I'm writing. I know a lot of writers are afraid to be reading, afraid it'll kind of jar whatever they have in place. But I find it very helpful, especially to read in the genre that I'm writing in, because I can see just sort of sentence for sentence how great certain writers are. And even the books that are just out that maybe I wish I'd written, or that I'm a little jealous of, but then I read them and think, this book is so successful because of the writing. And I feel like that really helps me go back to my own work and try and infuse each sentence with a little more energy. But there's different ranges of reading, and this is something I often would tell my students too. It's, if you read aim too high, then you get a little depressed, right? It's like, I can never write like that. Then you read what's dominating the bestseller list, which is not always, but often you say, wow, I can do better than that. So you just need to find your comfort zone and the thing that makes you want to emulate what other people are writing. So
The
thank you.
Goldilocks theory of how to read when you're a
Oh
writer.
yeah, I never thought of that. That's very good.
This book is just right.
That's good.
Do we have any other questions? Anybody else?
Yes.
Susan, you mentioned other titles that were suggested. I just wish you'd please share some of those with us.
Other titles, you mean that I'm reading right now?
No.
Oh.
But you said there were other titles suggested for this book.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. There were a lot. None of them felt quite. I think I started, my original working title was The Wonder, which I liked because it sort of, amazement, awe, wonder was sort of what was in my mind when I started writing that. But that was rejected within a hot second. As was anything to do with the Mothman or bridges, which I pushed back on a little bit, but I understand why they didn't want that either. So there were many, many lists of titles sort of similar to where we wound up, all playing on fictions, other fictions, minor fictions, catastrophes. I wanted to be careful with the word catastrophe, though, because I didn't want it to feel too whimsical with the title, with that word in the title. So, yeah, I'm having that conversation again for the next book. My title has been rejected already, so, but.
May I suggest this is not about Penn Faulkner?
Well, I might throw that in.
Yeah.
This is not about you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Susan, as has been noted, your books are very centered in Washington or this area, and I think that's part of your voice and obviously earns you a big following here. Do your publishers ever suggest, you're too rooted in Washington, your market is too limited, or is there an appreciation that that's part of your voice and that people around the country will also appreciate it?
Yeah, no one's ever said that. In fact, not from publishers, but from readers, friends who I rely on to read for me, have urged me to kind of lean into the Washington part, because that is what I know. It's funny, I'm not from Washington, and I find it almost impossible, as you've heard, to not absorb wherever I currently am, even though I don't set out with the intention of writing about any place I'm working or living, but it just, I think I'm very setting driven writer. I think other people will tell you they start with an idea, they start with a character. I start with the setting. Even every book that I've written, I can sort of identify the spot where it came from. So I think that's also probably at this point a good thing, to just be known as a Washington writer. It's certainly, I'm very appreciative of the support that I get locally. And
Any plans to turn to New England? I know you spent some time.
no. Well, I mean, I say that, and if I move there, probably that will be the next thing to happen. But yeah, everywhere I've been, that's what I've written, even if it hasn't wound up. I wrote a first novel that never got published, thankfully, set in India from when I was living in India. So I absorb wherever I am. So, thank you.
I think we're out of time, so let's thank Susan.
Thank you, Gwydion. Thank you, Brad and Lissa.
So,
Thank you.
Susan, thank you very much. And Gwydion, I want to tell you that I know exactly how you're feeling while you're waiting for Susan to finish her next book, because that's how I felt while she was writing Bookish People.
And nothing bad happened.
No,
right?
except I am mentioned by name in Bookish People. It's a case of